I want to welcome you on behalf of Superintendent Hoffmeister to this webinar this afternoon. We're really excited to bring you this information. We think that this will be very helpful for you, and we certainly want to be as cognizant of your needs as possible. And so we've kind of looked at several of the questions we've been getting and other things to try to put this together to be as much of that help as it can be for you. I think that if you have questions for us today as we go, if you'd like to put those in the chat box, we'll do our best to look at those and try to answer those as we go. I also think if you're having trouble with connectivity, if you'll turn off your video, I think that makes everything go a little bit smoother. So that might, if you're having trouble seeing anything or hearing anything, that might be something to try. But I think we'll go ahead and get started. Most of you know Zada Sery, our grants manager, and she's going to lead us through part of this work today, and then I will see you back at the end.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today's presentation, we are going to go over some frameworks for considering the work ahead during this time. Look at some guiding principles that might help you determine expenditures for the upcoming summer and fall. Look at the CARES Act and go over what that is and different opportunities that are available to you under the CARES Act. Then we'll look at some flexibilities for ongoing investments. These are programs you're already familiar with. They just have some flexibilities that have increased due to this time. And then at the end of the presentation, we will talk about a rapid response planning tool that has been developed to help you with your planning needs as we move into the summer. Like Brooke said, some housekeeping items that we have just for meetings like these is please keep your microphones muted. You will receive a link to the presentation in a couple of days. It is being recorded, so you will have access to it. And again, just what Brooke said, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat box, and we will make sure to get those answered. If we can't answer them today, then we will get you a response later on this week. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so where do we begin? As LEA administrators, this can be a very overwhelming time. And so this section is designed to look at a framework for starting the planning that you need to be doing as we move through these uncertain times. And this is a quote that talks about the fact that while this pandemic is real and it is uncertain and there's lots of safety factors going on, it also can be looked at from the perspective of being an opportunity to be creative, to be innovative, and to really use this as a way to maybe do some things that you've wanted to try out in the past. And this is the time that might be appropriate to try some of those things out. So the guiding principles, there are three main guiding principles. The first one is to ensure the continuity of basic services. And so when we think about this, we're thinking about food security as an example, maybe for your lower income students and families. We are also looking at partnering with local agencies to address those needs if you're not already doing so. The second one is to focus on equitable support for students that need it most. This might look different in a distance learning environment versus in your brick and mortar classroom. So we want you to think about the needs of the students that might be exacerbated at home. So this still might be your English learners, it still might be your special education students, but there might also be other students that are struggling with distance learning that don't necessarily struggle when they're in the classroom with that face-to-face teacher. An example that has already been shared, I'm sure you've had it at your sites, is the students that are at home maybe with one parent, or they have both parents that are working during this time, and so they don't necessarily have someone at home helping them with their distance learning during the daytime like other students have. So that's a student that we would think about during this time that wouldn't necessarily struggle if we were back in the classroom. And the third guiding principle is, despite the unknown, don't wait to plan. This is a new experience for all of us involved. And this is taking the time to develop plans that have options in them for different circumstances that may arise. So we think about plans for the summer, having different options, for next fall, the different circumstances that might arise, and then of course a more long-term plan. Again, the situation is the opportunity to be creative and innovative. Right. So this is the, we broke it down into phases, and the first phase, I'm sure everyone is in right now. This is the urgent phase, 0 to 3 months. This is where most everyone is right now. The objective here is to adapt learning environments to the extent possible. That also uphold orders to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. Right. And this is the ultimate challenge right now. So when we look at some sample strategies for this particular time period, we're looking at engaging families and assessing needs. The relationship between the teacher and the parent is really critical at this point in where we are. Having that communication allows teachers to gauge what supports that student's needs right now during distance learning. And that can go into addressing the basic students' needs, such as the meal delivery, increasing mental health support, and access to learning opportunities. Systems of connectivity and access to curriculum, not only having the technology, but ensuring that everyone knows how to use it, what your expectations are, and where to get help. And then finally, setting up your staff, your teachers, your aides, your specialists with all the information, resources, and training that they need to be successful in this new environment. The next phase, which some of you might already be in, if not, you're probably getting ready to be there, is the recovery phase. And the objective here is to reflect on learnings from urgent phase, lay the groundwork for an effective school opening, and initiate coordination between and among school staff and local agencies. So after the basic services are in place, we move into this recovery phase. State officials here are looking at when to reopen schools. Local officials are also looking at when to reopen schools, how to reopen schools, including buildings. But all of that is still very uncertain here. The CDC and health officials are working on health and safety measures for reopening. Again, it's still uncertain as to what that will look like when buildings actually reopen. So when we look at sample strategies for this phase, we're looking for establishing action teams. They can address issues beyond a typical school start or a school event. An example would be students may have experienced an adverse childhood trauma due to this virus, due to the uncertainty of changing their routine or having to be at home or having a loved one that has become sick or worse with this virus. And so these action teams can have, they can be valuable in having them in place to identify and address the specific needs of those students as they return to school, possibly in the fall. Schools should also look at collaborating with other organizations to increase mental health support services. And then again, looking at your budgets, knowing what funding sources you have, how those funding sources can be applied, planning for budget revisions if certain circumstances occur. And then finally, taking a hard look at your school improvement plans, developing ways to keep the momentum that you built in FY20, school year 20, while acknowledging that these circumstances have changed. The next phase is being called stabilization. So this we're really thinking about next school year, so that the 2021 school year. And the objective here is to focus on learning recovery, anticipate the needs of your staff, your students, and your families to adapt to the changes in health guidelines. Sample strategies for planning for this phase are really being able to have a plan with options. And those options can help with circumstances as they arrive if we have a resurgence of the virus. Again, that is possible to happen in the fall. Investing in your resources and activities that would happen for those plans. And then shoring up those transitions as in how your students and teachers transition from the classroom to distance learning and then back again. All of those things should be incorporated into your plans and then trained on so that everyone is aware of their responsibilities. And then we're looking at firming up those connections with other agencies and community partners. Again, having those plans in place with the different circumstances laid out so that everyone knows ahead of time whose responsibility is what needs to be done at what time if X issue happens. If everyone is already trained on what their roles are, it can speed up your response time. And this would be the same for your action team, having them in place, having their plans laid out. And so if something arises, then you have a faster response time and a smoother transition to wherever you need to go, whether it's distance learning or back in the classroom. And then finally, we want to say, just don't forget about your parents and your guardians when you're making these plans. Make sure you're including them in whatever you're developing, what their needs might be, and what information needs to get out to them, and at what time that information needs to go out. So, what do we need? This is a different question than maybe you would think about for the start of your typical year. You know that you're not going to be able to do everything in the same way that you did for the start of last school year. And that's because the landscape has changed and maybe the resources are different. So you're going to need to prioritize. So a few notes on prioritization. You're going to start by identifying your school's values, asking what your highest values are, and these decisions that you're making for your plans, do they align with those values? Then you're going to look at the primary services that are the foundation of how your school educates your students. And you're going to ask what these primary services are. When we talk about using funds, not only are we talking about spending with future goals in mind, but using your funds strategically, knowing your funding source, how your funds can be used. Are the purchases appropriate at this time, or should they be done at a different time? And then, are you supporting your school's improvement goals with these other purchases? And finally, we want to put equity in the forefront of all decision making. So this is a flow chart that breaks down some key questions for you and your leadership team as you discuss your school's base services. In your continuous improvement plan, you've already identified a mission and vision statement. So you can start by revisiting that. And if it needs to be adjusted due to the circumstances of COVID-19, then that's a great place to start and adjust your mission and vision from there. And then next, looking at what are your obligations to your students and family. An example would be that most of you probably don't have the nutritional needs of your students spelled out in your mission or vision statement, and yet that's what you do, and that is a service that you are providing to those families. Third is to look at those compliance issues. What is the federal, state, and local requirements of your school? From there, you can identify the base services that the school needs to provide to meet the mission, the obligations, and the requirements, as well as what supports are needed to ensure equitable access to all students. And again, you're listing all of these things out. So this is all stuff that you are pulling from other resources, having meetings with your leadership team, having those discussions, and then writing it down. And once you have that list of services and supports, then you can look at the resources that you already have to meet these, and then those that you still need in your school. So why is it important? As CSI designated sites, you started this type of thinking last year in your continuous improvement plan. You all completed very detailed needs assessments, which fed into developing your improvement plans, which included action steps that can be supported with different funding streams. The concept here is the same. It's identifying the need first and then finding the resources to align or support those needs. One more note because I forgot. So again, this is helping you plan for changes in funding levels also as it comes up for the next year, because we know that's going to happen, and it helps with keeping your resources aligned with your needs. Okay, so how do we get what we need right now? So we're going to talk about the CARES Act. This act is about relief, and it's about getting you through until your new normal. And the first thing we're going to talk about is one-time expenses versus ongoing expenses. At this time, the CARES Act is a one-time funding source. And when we think about that, we know we are not going to want to use CARES Act funds to support ongoing expenditures like teacher and staff salaries, contracted services, traditional instructional coaching, etc. We don't want to use these funds for things that you're going to have to keep going year after year. We're going to focus the CARES Act funds on quote unquote one-time purchases. Examples of these include technology, delivering of materials or meals to students during distance learning times, stipends for COVID-related activities outside of the contract day. And you'll notice here on the left side of the slide, it talks about license. So I want to touch on that just a little bit. It talks about licenses for online learning. And as every single financial person at a school knows, licenses can be pretty much considered ongoing or an annual expense. So what we want you to think about is using these funds to get something started for your school for distance learning, maybe trying out a different system than what you've used in the past. But at the same time, if you want to continue that license or using that platform into the future and integrate it into your regular school year, then just be aware of what other funding sources are out there that you can use to support those licenses after the CARES Act funds have expired. And the cardinal rule of one-time funds is that they should not be going for ongoing positions. And specifically, we're talking about those classroom teacher or classroom level salaries and benefits. This goes a little bit into what the CARES Act is, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. It gave $2 trillion in emergency funding for states, businesses, and individuals. It is considered a relief package and not a stimulus package in terms of education. And the funding under the CARES Act is very, very flexible. There's $30.75 billion for education for all the states. Oklahoma will be receiving approximately $161 million. Superintendent Hoffmeister released a press release yesterday with information on the CARES Act funding and application process for Oklahoma. If you did not receive that press release, it is available on the State Department of Education's website. So now we're going to get into the allowable use of these CARES Act funds. They're intended to be used in the following areas, and I'm going to read those to you as we go through the slides, or on specific relief activities. There are 12 allowable areas of use. As we read through these, if you have specific questions, you can definitely type those in the chat box and we'll try to get you an answer at the end of the presentation or later on this week if we can. If you think of questions after this presentation, please reach out to us so we can get those answers for you. So area number 1 is any activity authorized by ESEA or ESSA. So what you're doing in your regular federal programs right now under that federal law would be acceptable. The example that they've provided here is when thinking about distance learning, providing a virtual drop-in tutoring services for students. And so you could look at funding the stipends for the teacher to act as the tutor during those times, or whatever technological needs that teacher or student might have to receive those tutoring services. The second area is LEA coordination of coronavirus efforts with other public agencies. Again, we're talking about any expenditure that would relate back to the supporting of your LEA, your district or school, participating in a task force or connecting with other agencies to increase services, whether it be mental health, whether it be services for homeless students, whatever collaborations you have going on, it's expenditures related to that. The third category is resources to meet the needs of individual schools. And the example that was given here is that we know that every school is different and that every student population has some unique factors to it. And so in your particular school, you may have a circumstance in which a majority of your students have caregivers who are also medical health professionals, and they're having to work during this. There's health restrictions that they have to be conscious of when they're at home. And so it's working with those students and families to meet the needs of those specific students in that specific circumstance. Category 4 is activities to address the unique needs of federally recognized student subgroups. And what we're saying here is if it's a subgroup on your report card, those are the populations that we're talking about. And so it's looking at expenditures or providing for expenditures that would address those needs, whether it be extra laptops, additional supports for homeless shelters if you have a large homeless population. Area 5 is developing systems to improve the LEA response. So for those of you that have parent communication systems or are wanting parent communication systems, this would be a good investment of your funds. Our example here is updating text-based communication systems to alert students and families about changing conditions, requirements, and services. So that is definitely an area. Number 6 is training for LEA staff on sanitation and minimizing the spread. So this is looking at using CARES Act funds for expenditures related to your janitorial staff going to and attending trainings with public health organizations on how to clean the building. Area 7 is actually purchasing cleaning supplies for schools. So think about rubber gloves, masks, any sort of cleaning supplies. That is an area where CARES Act funds should be invested. Area 8 is planning for and coordinating the continuation of base services during long-term closure. When we think about that, we're thinking about those plans that we talked about in the first couple of sections. If that situation arose, what would need to take place in order to transition from classroom back to distance learning, and then what would it take if you had to do it for an extended amount of time? The example here is hiring a short-term coordinator or working with existing staff to pay them an extra duty fund to be the coordinator of those types of services when that need arrives. Number 9 is purchasing instructional technology for students. This is, again, you're thinking about distance learning. You're thinking about what are the technological needs of your students and your teachers and any other support people for those distance learning environments. So again, here we're talking about purchasing laptops. We're talking about purchasing hotspots. We're talking about investing in those technological needs for the students as well as the teachers and the school. Area 10 is providing mental health services and support. That's been a key issue throughout the entire pandemic so far. And so we're looking at expenditures aligning with, possibly contracting or paying overtime to mental health professionals to make home visits or to have those sort of Zoom meeting visits, or at least, having someone that the students can have access to if they need to. Area 11 is planning for and implementing summer and after school time instructional programming. We have had a lot of schools be very aware of what they want to do in the summertime and have actually already started planning what they want their summer and after school time programming to look like in 2020. The examples here are expenses that would be associated with working with local museums, libraries, possibly the zoo, for designing and implementing grade level appropriate activities during the summertime. And so number 12, if you will recall a few short slides ago, we talked about not using CARES Act funds for ongoing expenditures like salaries and benefits, and yet category number 12 says activities necessary to continue services and employment of existing staff. And so what we want to say on this is that yes, it is an allowable expense, but it is not the intent of these funds. If you as an LEA choose to use the CARES Act to fund salaries, then it needs to be a last resort and it needs to be as short term as possible. So we definitely don't want to get someone in a situation where you funded their position with temporary funds and then the funds go away or expire and you don't have any funds to continue their services. In the next section, we're going to talk about other ways to address possible future shortfalls. There we go. Okay. Additional education-related funding. These are the nationwide funding amounts in other education-related programs. This is useful in helping you plan on which agencies that you're going to coordinate with, and knowing that they do have some CARES Act funding of their own. And so this will help you to plan the coordination of those two funding sources together. Recommendations, again, as we've said before, use these funds, these CARES Act funds, for one-time or short-term expenses that are going to increase the quality and the equity of the instructional delivery during school closures. Really try, if you can, to avoid ongoing or long-term expenditures with these CARES Act funds. How do we resource for an unclear future? So now we're going to talk about some flexibilities for those funding sources that you're already familiar with, your title programs and etc. This is just a reminder slide that, again, as we talk about these flexibilities, we're still really looking at and thinking about basic services, equitable support, and then planning for those unknowns. The key concepts in this section are the redeployment of your staff, the intent and allowability of different title programs, the basics of federal fiscal flexibility, supplement, not supplant, and then we'll look at some national emergency waivers that have come out of the COVID-19 response. So in the redeployment of staff, we're really asking schools to map out their skilled staff's, their staff's skill sets, that's kind of hard to say, and availability in order to best meet the needs of their students in a distance learning environment. You may have an attendance officer or other staff whose routine changes from when they're in a brick and mortar classroom type setting to when they're in a distance learning environment. They can't provide the same, can't provide the same services in that distance learning environment. And so we're mapping out what their skill set is and how that person's role might be adapted to that distance learning environment. We know that every school is going to be different, and so you can really tailor this and use it in a creative way so that all the staff in your regular brick and mortar school building have an important role and position in that distance learning environment as well. They give you some examples here on the slide. And it's talking about, if you have a literacy coach, they can be creating lesson plans for small group interventions. You can have an assistant principal that is also in the distance learning environment, leading those family engagement efforts. So intent and allowability, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the names of these title programs. These are not all the title programs. This is just a select sample here. ESA focuses on the intent of the funds, allowing for more flexibility than in what is actually purchased. As you know, this is a change from NCLB. And this table gives you a breakdown of the various intents of the different title programs. This is a great tool. This chart is a great tool that you can use when you're having those planning discussions with your leadership team about how to align those needs with an appropriate funding source. especially if you're looking at starting something with the CARES Act and then continuing it long term. What would be an appropriate funding source to continue paying for annual distance learning licenses after the CARES Act funds goes away? Federal fiscal flexibility, which is a bit tricky to say fast. Before we talk about these three areas, transferability, consolidation, and discretion, we need to note that we're talking specifically about your Title funds. We're talking about those Title I, Title II, Title III funds. School improvement funds, competitive grants like 21st Century, and IDEA are not eligible for these three areas in the state of Oklahoma. So first one is transferability. As you know, when you go into your federal programs consolidated application, you do have the option to transfer your funds and then consolidate your funds within that application, moving it from one source into another. And again, so long as you continue to meet the requirements of those programs, this might be an option to consider if you need help in funding long-term initiatives that you've started with the CARES Act. LEA discretion, this has to do with how your district expends the funds internally, whether they choose to do rank order or another way of disseminating their funds out to their sites. ESSA allows some latitude on how the sites receive funds and how the LEAs dispense those funds. So it can be individual to each site, and each site has a budget, or the services can be offered district-wide. Supplement, not supplant. This is a favorite phrase here in the world of federal programs. So we still have this rule. However, there is more flexibility under ESSA than there was in NCLB. The key focus on this slide are the exceptions, of which there are 4. And the most important one, or the most relevant one that might be headed your direction, is the second bullet point. And it says an LEA may overcome the second presumption of supplanting if it can demonstrate with evidence that the program or activity will be eliminated due to state or local funding reductions. Economic circumstances as a result of the pandemic might produce a need for LEAs to use this exception. So definitely keep that in mind as you move forward in your planning and during your school year when you see any sort of economic fluctuations that we're pretty sure are going to come our way. We just don't know when, and we don't know how it will really affect the bottom line. And the last slide that we have is about emergency waivers. This offers a tremendous amount of flexibility to LEAs for the next school year. All of these waivers that you see listed on the slide fall under the CARES Act, and they are in effect until June of 2021. Oklahoma has applied for these waivers, and we do have some approved already. Superintendent Hoffmeister has issued press releases regarding Oklahoma's waiver requests and approvals over the last several weeks. And again, those are available on the state's website. So at this time, I'm going to check the chat, see if we have any questions I can answer. So will there be CARES coding? So in the press release that Superintendent Hoffmeister issued, there is information in there on the application process. There is no specific coding as far as OCAS that I'm aware of. But there is some accountability in the application and budget process. And then will this webinar be available? Yes, it will. We are recording it and we will send it out to everyone who registered today. So at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Brooke. to finish out our presentation.
Thank you, Zada. That's such great information, and I really appreciate you going through that so methodically. Sometimes there are things we think, oh, we already know that, but we need to think about it in a different way right now, and I think Zada brought that home for us really well. For whatever reason, I'm not able to advance the slides, so let me figure that out. Okay, so a good first step. So the school support team has spent a little bit of time in the last few weeks looking at how we can best support you in these next few months. And we came up with a rapid response planning tool. And so you can actually look at this planning tool at the website that's at the bottom of this slide. It's a bit.ly site, rapid response cycle, and the capitalization matters in this. But you'll be able to look at that, but I'll show you some of it today too. So we really wanted to think about how can we get past this urgent stage. We know you all have been in the, oh my gosh, what do we need right now, and get it very, very quickly. But we also want to think about how can that look over time as we continue to be in this recovery and stabilization period. So we're hoping that this tool will help guide your conversations that you're having at your schools and your districts about your priorities, your challenges, making progress on those priorities, the needs and opportunities with potential areas of concern that maybe you haven't had to think about in the past, how we make actions for immediate response, and then progress monitoring frequently so we can tell if what we've decided to do is working. Again, you can see this full tool at that bit.ly address at the bottom of this screen. So the tool really starts with a current reflection. And this is really just asking you, what have you been spending time on in the last 4 weeks? And is that still something that you need to be spending time on? Or have you made progress on that and it's time to go on to something else? And then also, what is of most concern to you right now? And I think if you answered that question today, what is of concern to you right now, it's different than it was a month ago. It's different than it was on March 17th for sure. And the answer will be different 4 weeks from now, and 8 weeks from now, and 3 months from now. So we wanted to just give you some very basic questions just as a reflection for you as a leader, but also perhaps with your leadership team to just take a look at what is it that we're really focused on right now, and is that what we need to be doing? Maybe it is. Then we also have a little bit more detailed immediate needs identification. And so we've tried to come up with some areas of concern that we think that you would be considering during this time of recovery and stabilization. So it's things like logistics, staff capacity, readiness for technology, how culture and engagement, it looks different, what student support looks like now. Are we thinking about equity and access in all the ways that we possibly can? And so we've just kind of bulleted out some things and then asked you some questions about those. So if you're thinking about, let's say, staff capacity, that was our area of concern. Then we might say, okay, what action have you taken to address this area in the last 4 weeks? And we're just asking you to think through that. And then what still needs to be done or solved within this area of staff capacity, for example. And then what support or resources do we need? So this tool is really to help you go through several areas to consider and to look at what have you done, what needs do we still have, and what resources will we need to make that happen, just as a good conversation starter. After you've gone through that immediate needs assessment, then we have a rapid response plan. And that's simply asking you to just take 1 or 2 of those considerations that you feel like you need to focus on in the immediate future and to come up with a plan for that, just like you always do. SMART goals, you all know how to write those. Action plans that you want to take, who's going to take those on, and when, and a timeline. And so this part of the planning tool just gives you a little bit of structure for that. And then response tracking. And so this is just a structure for you to look at your progress on these areas more frequently than we might be used to. Usually when we think about an improvement plan, we have an action plan and we follow that for an entire school year and we measure things at the end of the year. What this is asking you to do is to really set shorter term goals. So 4 to 8 week goals, and then have checkpoints every week or every 10 days so that everyone on the team can really see we are making progress on that. That's a good thing. We need to keep doing that. When there are so many new things coming at us right now, it's hard to kind of keep everything in its perspective. We cannot fix 10 things at once, but we can probably fix 2 things at once. And so we're hoping that this recovery tool will help you focus on those things. And then as you complete that cycle of improvement, you can go right back and start again. So this checkpoint just asks you, what actions have you taken? What progress have you made? And what additional actions or changes do you need to do? And the idea of this tool is the thought that you would use this over and over again. Every 4 to 8 weeks, your leadership team could sit down and go through it again so that you're sure that you're always identifying your most current need, the most current concern, and that you're taking advantage of every resource that comes your way. If we think about the resources that we had on March 17th when this all began, and the resources we had at the end of April compared to the resources that superintendent released in the press release today, our resources have changed, and they will continue to change. And so some rapid response cycle work will help us keep on top of all of that, and will help us keep moving towards this stabilization period. So I think at this point, Zada, I still can't see the chat box. Can you?
Yeah, I can still see it. So
Okay.
If anybody has any questions these last few minutes, feel free to type those in and we can try and answer those right now. And again, if you think of any questions later on after the presentation is over, feel free to reach out to us or to your specialist and ask those questions, and we'll get you some answers.
One thing to think about also as you're putting some questions in the chat box, your school support specialist knows this recovery tool. They can absolutely help you walk through it, have conversations with you about it, and to really get you moving forward to taking advantage of all of this. I see Zada smiling, so something must have come in.
We had a request to put us on speed dial.
Oh, your school support specialist probably is on speed dial, but I'm going to take this opportunity to let you know that even though we're not in the office, our office phone numbers still work. They go directly to voicemail, and those voicemails come to us in the form of an email almost immediately. So don't be afraid if the phone rings and you hear a voicemail. Go ahead and tell us what you need, because we'll get that as an email and we will get right back to you. But thank you for saying that. We like being on speed dial. That's a good thing. Anything else, Zada?
No. Will these funds be competitive or by general allocation? Brooke, you want to take that one?
Absolutely. Actually, it will be both. And so you'll receive an allocation. And if you look at superintendent's press release this morning, there is a link to a spreadsheet where you can see what every single district in the state will receive. You'll see the amount they will receive, including yourselves. So you can take a look at that. But you also need to know that the state's portion, meaning the OSDE's portion of the CARES funds, we're going to roll those out competitively. And the information for that is also in that press release today. So you'll be in the position where you'll receive some formulaic funds and have the opportunity to compete for some other funds. Great question. Thank you.
The next question talks about the supplement versus supplant exceptions. And the question is, the second exception that we talked about specifically for title funds can be used when state or local funds are lost due to COVID. It's not specific to COVID, although that's probably going to be your main cause for some sort of revenue shortfall this coming fall or even into the spring. So if that happens in your community, state and local funds too, to really go back to those exemptions for supplement and supplant and see if any of those apply, and you can utilize those flexibilities in those exemptions. The next one, will non-public schools have to provide any information to SDE to take advantage of a portion of the CARES funds?
I'm going to refer you to superintendent's press release on that and the frequently asked questions. I certainly don't want to misspeak on that. So I'm going to refer you back to her press release. Does that seem like all of them, Zada?
That seems like it for right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate your time, and we know how busy you are and how hard it is to sit and watch yet another Zoom call webinar, but we really do appreciate you. And like Zada said, we will send this recording out to you along with the slides. You can contact us at any time you want. Contact your school support specialist. However you want to reach out, we are absolutely here to help you. We are the Office of School Support. That's what we do. And we want to help you through this time. If there aren't any more questions, we'll just say good afternoon and have a lovely evening.